So today we'll talk about the things that you need to take into account to ensure that your deployment of teams is going to rock. And the things that I will probably share, or the things that I will share with you, are probably not the things that you would think of first, but I think really that these are the most important things. So stick around, and I'm curious to hear from you whether that's something that you would take into account or not, and how that went. If you would already deploy teams in your company, how that went. Before we start, let's have a quick look at sponsors. Have a look at their site. Thank them. Do mention that you heard about them from Russ to basically extra appreciate the fact that they made this event available to us. Cool. So your company wants to go to Teams, right? And that is all cool. You have probably heard a lot about Teams. You heard all about the cool features, video calls, sharing files, collaboration, IM, and so forth and so on. So you are really excited about going to Teams, and that's cool. But you also might have heard about things like sprawl, adoption issues, like how to ensure that everybody works, that there are no issues with teams, permissions, and so forth and so on. So with that, you want to like, okay, how can we ensure? What can I do to ensure that teams will land in our company just fine? That adoption will rock, and that you will avoid all these different issues that you hear about a lot. And the interesting thing is that it's not like there is not enough guidance, right? Because if you search for things like Teams adoption, Teams best practice, like you will find of millions of different things, varying from presentations to white papers to infographics, basically giving you all the different tips and tricks about what are the different things you have to do, you have to have in your teams to ensure that they will work just fine, right? And there might be about all the different things like permissions and naming conventions and whatnot. But is this exactly what you need the most? Or maybe there are different things that you should think about first. So oftentimes, the way I see it is that we love tech advice. We love these top 10 tips, top 5 tips, 5 best practices. We love these different technical things in a way, like namings conventions and policies and permissions, security. We love these things. But why? Because they are intriguing. They're technical. They are not always easy. They are not simple, and that's why they intrigue us, and they basically suck us in into uh, trying to know more, learn more, and then with that we easily forgot about like what is really the most important. So we love to like dive deep into these simple practices and tips and white papers and so forth and so on regarding things like organizing teams and channels and naming conventions and how to do rollout and how to ensure advocates. But I like to argue that this is not really the best place to start. This is not what is the most important. There are more important things that you should be thinking about. So, what I like to think is that it all starts with the hard questions, right? And if you ask them out loud, if you go around and ask folks whom you know, your colleagues, your management, that's like they might perceive that as, well, you're against change. Like you're not willing to adopt. You're against it. Like you fight it. But in reality, it's actually the way around. It's exactly because you care. It's exactly because you want teams to rock. Like you will be asking these hard questions, right? And these things need to come first. You have to ask these things first before you even think about implementation and what to do and how to do it, because only then you will be able to ensure that whatever you put in place, that will actually work, and that will achieve its goal. That teams will actually help you and not just turn into another tool. So what are the different things that you should ask, right? And the interesting thing is like none of these things are related to tech. So the first and foremost, like the most important thing is, what is the problem at hand? What are you actually trying to solve? Is it, for example, to keep everybody around you up to date about what's going on within your department, your team, your organization? Is it maybe to collaborate? Is it maybe exactly like in the time like now, to be able to work at home and to stay with each other in touch? Um, Maybe you want to address the global workforce and remote workforce and problems and so forth and so on, right? So this is the very most important thing that you have to understand first before you even do anything else. Because otherwise, like if you don't understand what problem you're trying to solve, you will roll out teams, you will make it available, but then you will not be able to explain to anybody like why it's there. And with that, you will lose everybody, right? So if you really want to ensure that teams will land the way you want it to, that it will end up success, you have to ensure that you have that you properly understand the problem at hand that you want teams to address, or even just like what problems within the company you want to solve, right? Maybe not even it's not even at this stage about teams at all, maybe, right? Because then the next step is, what is the best way to do it? Maybe it's teams, maybe it's not. Depending on what problem you want to solve, maybe teams is not the answer to it at all, but maybe it is, right? So at this stage, it's really key that you try to stay as far away from tech as you can and try to imagine that you could do anything in the world. What would be the best solution for the problem you want to address? Maybe it's email. Maybe it is just picking up the phone. But maybe it is indeed Teams, right? So it's really key that at this stage you try to brainstorm as many different things as you can and not really try to use Teams as this new hammer and then where everything else becomes nails, right? And then finally, the thing is, like, once you know what problem you want to solve and what would be the best way to do it, another thing to ask yourself is, why actually haven't you done it yet? What's in your way? Are you blocked by resources? Are you blocked by funds? Are you blocked by people, by politics, by culture, resources? What is in your way? Because this is also key to basically complete picture of what is it that you're trying to solve and what are the different things that you might need to overcome before you can put anything in place, right? And like, these things sounds very much like open doors. I'm pretty sure that everyone of you is like, yeah, but that's of course you need to do all of that, right? But then on the other hand, like time over time, I see that because these things are exactly open doors, people often think like, well, somebody else took care of that, right? And because everybody thinks that, in the end, nobody does them. And then at the end of the day, like you end up pointing at each other and saying like, yeah, but I thought like, didn't you do it? Yeah, but didn't you? But I thought that the management would do it, right? But because like you would assume that somebody needs to know, right? But it turns out that like more than often, it turns out not to be the case. Seriously, like it sounds trivial, but it's not. And exactly because of that is this hard truth that people often feel uncomfortable with, because it means that you need to think this through, and at some point you might be asking these things that like, no, let's not spend time talking about problems. Let's teams, like we heard great thing about teams, let's put teams in place because that will solve everything. And there's this interesting case where the other day I talked to a customer of ours who would also again roll out teams, right? And it seems like they went through all the hoops, they had everything in place, they had governance in place, they had all the best practices in place. And for the first month, adoption was seemingly going through the roof. Like everything seemed to be just fine. But then at some point it would stop. And after a few weeks, they would see that actually like the usage seemed to go down. Eventually, the whole thing was covered in dust. Why? Because the original idea, like the original drive for them to roll out Teams, was that one of the managers high up the chain uh, would talk to someone else that they knew, and that person had Teams in their org, and it's like, yeah, like it was so fantastic tech. It had this great abilities, like everything was great, and basically they wanted to have it too. They didn't want to be the company without Teams. So basically, just the fact to have tech in place was the main driver for them to have it. But as such, they didn't adopt it internally. They didn't sell it. They didn't really think through what problems they wanted to have solved, right? And what's even more is that deploying Teams amplified a few things that they had in their company. Sharing things openly, discussing things openly was not a part of the culture that they had. So as a result, you can imagine like teams were empty. No one didn't share anything. Why? Because that wasn't in their genes, and nobody really um, drove through this change, this cultural change, to actually think this through and encourage people to share in the open. So with that, yes, they had tech in place, they ticked the box, but in the end, they didn't achieve anything with that. So the whole effort in the end was for naught. Why? Because they didn't think it's true. Why? Because they didn't ask these simple and yet complex, hard things, right? It wasn't clear to them what they wanted to do and what was the best way to do it, right? And in the end, like they ended up having a channel with pictures of cats, menu of what would be available to eat today. But other than that, like teams were not used at all. So it was a big miss for them because they could have done with that so much more if only they thought this through. Now, when you think about having teams in place, there's this one important thing you have to do, right? Typically, when we work, we often afraid to talk too much. Because we already feel like we meet so much and we talk too much. Like it's time to work. It's time to make results. It's time to show the miles that we make, right? So we are afraid to talk too much and do too little. But think, think about it. When you want to put teams in place, what you want to really do is drive change. You want to change how people work. And that also means you need to change how they think, behavior, right? You need to change something that is very ingrained in them. And for that, you need them to buy in your promise of change, right? They need to understand that. And this is really the only way for people to buy in whatever you want to sell, in the better promise of tomorrow, how you work, collaborate, communicate, and so forth and so on, is for them to understand. First of all, you need to ensure that it's clear to them why you want to change, like what's wrong currently, what's not enough, and why we need to change as a company. Is there a threat? Is there something else external to us? Maybe it's current times, right? There's virus. Maybe there are some other things, competitors. I don't know. Like there might be different reasons that justify this change, and everybody needs to know about it. And oftentimes it's already at this step, like many managers think already, like, like people know about it. Like our employees are so dedicated. They know the company, they know the business, they know the market. I'm pretty sure I would bet my hand on it that they know. And it turns out that they don't. So already like this first step, why do you want to change? What drives you to that, right? That is one. Two, why this way? For every change, if you ask within the company, everybody will have different idea what is the best way to achieve the goal, to actually implement the change. And If you came up with a way, and if that way is to implement teams, you have to explain to everybody, like, why this way? Why is it the best thing? What other things have you taken into account, reviewed, and what other things didn't make it, and why? You have to explain them all of that, because only if they understand, they will be on your side. Eventually, what is the goal? What is the objective? What is the end point? Where you want to go with that? That also needs to be clear. Next step, how will you get there from where you are today to where you want to be? Also, that needs to be clear. People need to know what different steps you will take so that at any point in time they can see whenever they feel uncomfortable, and they definitely will. Why? Because they will change. You will expect them to change the way they work. So there will be times where things aren't clear, when it will be tempting to like reach back to the way you worked in the past. But at that time, if the process is clear, everybody will be able to say, you know what? We came from here, we're going there, and we're here. And we knew up front that it would be tough, but this is exactly a part of the plan. And that will give them the comfort to pull through the hard time of change, right? And also, the most important thing, now that they know why you want to change, why this way, the result, and the plan, you have to give them their role. How do they contribute to the change? How do they fit in the plan? Because I don't believe that you want them to blindly follow through, right, and do exactly what you say. No, they have a role to play, whether it's to be advocate, support others, or basically lead by example, right? So these are the different things that you can take into account, and they need to know about it. They crave to know how they fit in your plan, and it's your job to tell it to them, right? The interesting is that when you plan deployment of teams, or basically any other tech, it could be that all of them that is clear to the team that originally plans the change. There might be a management team that does that. There might be the CTO, CIO, and for that group, this might be perfectly clear. The thing is, not everybody is a part of the meetings that you have where you talk about this change, right? And probably a bigger group is not a part of that than actually is. So with that, you have to ensure that everybody knows. You have to ensure that everybody understand what's going on and where. Because otherwise, they will miss the context, details. They will miss everything. And with that, they will not be able to understand what is it that you're trying to do. And if they don't get it, they will not buy it. And it will be really tough. So it will be your job to explain it to them, and it will be very much rinse and repeat. And it will actually get so bad to the point that you will feel like you're repeating yourself over and over again. And that is good, because only at that point, when you get to the point of like, well, I've said it like 10 times already, only then you will be like, now they probably know, right? And at some point, after you've done it a few times, after you explain it to them a few times and kept them up to date of where you are, where you go, and so forth and so on, you will see a little change. You will basically know when it's enough, because then you will see a difference between they don't understand and basically object and resist. Maybe they just do not agree, right? Because like it's a, dream fantasy, basically, to assume that you will do your job, you will plan everything, you will explain them, and then everybody will be like that on board, right? That is not going to happen. There will be always folks who have different opinion, but there will be difference when you talk to them, and the arguments that you hear, you based on that be able to see whether they don't get it, and you basically need to better understand the whole idea behind it, or whether they simply do not agree, which is fine, right? Like if they don't agree with that, that is fine. But if they don't get it, that means that you need to improve your job. You have to do a better job explaining that, because otherwise you will be like trying to force it through, and it will never work, right? So basically, the key is that you need to communicate more than you think you you actually need. All right, action time. You've explained everything to everybody. You have everybody on board. Everything's clear. There is a plan. Everybody knows exactly what role they play in your plan, and things are clear. People get it. The next step is what you have a governance plan. And a governance plan is basically a big word, right? Because governance means, like, if you ask 10 folks, they will probably give you 10 answers. It means something else to everyone. And it basically is, right? Because, like, what's into there or what's in there? Well, it depends. And I don't mean it in the depends like the ignorant way. I mean it as governance plans depends a lot on um, like your your company. It needs to reflect who you are and what you want to achieve, right? And in that, you will think of technical things, right? So you will think about how you organize teams, whether you organize them by departments, classes, teams, projects. Who is allowed to create them? Do you allow it to everybody or only some folks? Who manages them? Who are the owners? What kind of apps you install? Which kind of tabs are available? Whether there's a policy to name them, or can any owner who creates a team can choose their own name? How do you work with externals? Where to store console? There's like tons of different things you can think about when you think about a governance plan for teams. And the one thing that we see is that teams grows a lot, right? Like more and more and more things are being introduced into teams, and the moment you extend them with apps, you only add to it, right? Because teams is this very powerful place that could become the place where every employee starts their day, right? And it could be entry to your LOB, to your different systems, applications, documents, collaboration, communication, and so on, so forth, right? So it really depends what you want to use Teams for. That different things need to be reflected in the governance plan you put in place. And there are a few things that you need to think about upfront, but really it's an illusion to think that you will be able to have all the answers upfront and that they will never change. So instead trying to cover every possible angle upfront, think about the few big things first, give teams to folks to use them, and then adjust over time. Because only then you will have the reality or the real usage within your company, which will be guaranteed different than anyone else's. The most important thing about the governance plan is that it must follow your culture. If you're a bank, your governance plan will be different than if you are, like, for example, the company I work for, Rancor, company of 20 odd folks. We are ISV in tech. We will have different governance plan than a hospital, than a school. Why? Because the culture is different, company is different, mentality is different, our needs are different, people that work in our place are different. And all of that needs to be expressed in the plan. Why? Because at the end of the day, whatever plan you put in place, it needs to be enforced. And if whatever you put in a plan will not match who you are, it will very quickly become this file that is somewhere on a shelf covered with dust, and that you spend a lot of time and effort to put together, but then nobody will ever use, right? So this is the really key thing for any governance plan that you put in place. It has to be an impression of who you are as a company, right? And that is exactly the whole point why there is no bulletproof answer to what needs to be included. You can take any template, but in the end you will probably like remove more things than you will keep in it, right? Because it needs to be yours. It really needs to be yours, and it doesn't need to be like polished documents, because you will change it anyway. Like, that's the whole point. Like, you don't know everything up front, so you need to put it in place, get to use Teams, and as you do, you will adjust the governance plans to actually meet the reality and be something that you can actually enforce in practice, right? So, all right, imagine Teams is on, right? And everybody gets why it's there. People use it, and basically every day they learn a little bit more of Teams, right? There are more chats, there are discussions, video calls, there are documents being shared. Um, as people use Teams, there are more channels. Basically, folks start to add more tabs and so forth and so on, and basically slowly but steadily adoption goes through the roof. But then one day there is this new guy John, who he tries to find some info about upcoming event, right? And he wonders like what is the right place to ask it, because there is this one channel, but then there's also this another team, and is it a marketing thing or is it a project that they have? It's like he is lost. And well, in a way, you know what? He is new, right? So maybe he just doesn't know. Maybe he still didn't find his way around. But then you get a similar ask from Sue and Steve and Bill, right? And slowly you start to realize, hey, maybe there is something else going on here. Because it's not just John, it's not just the new guy who cannot really find things. There's also things who used to work at your place for a longer time, right? It seems like it's a trend that people start having a hard time to find things in Teams, right? And if you look at charts, like you only see Teams usage go one way and it's up, right? So it's not like people don't share stuff. So what is going on exactly, right? And here you have it. Welcome to Sprawl. You've just become a victim of your own success, right? Teams become so well adopted that it's being used by anybody and everybody for anything and everything, right? And to be honest, you couldn't have really done anything about it. It's just a natural way of how things go. When teams are being used, they will grow eventually. And surely there will be something that you couldn't have or seen, right? You cannot know everything up front, right? So trying to know about all of that up front is basically a fool's errand. But yeah, well, you have this thing now where you have to do something about it because you don't want your folks to be lost. You want them to be able to collaborate, to work effectively and efficiently. And this is actually why you put teams in the first place, right? So, what are different things you can do, right? The other day, I talked to a customer who would go down the route. Okay, like we have a lot of stuff in Teams. Some of it is being used, some of it is not. How to know what things do we need? What are the things to keep? What are the things to clean? And they thought about this idea. Okay, let's entrust the governance of groups of our teams to owners. So basically, they would go through the list. They would see who the owners are, and they would say, "Okay, guys, this is your team. You created it. You are the owner. Now it's your job to tell us, the IT, or be, be, better yet, like if you don't need that, clean it up." The one thing that they didn't take into account that these owners are business folks. They have a full-time job to do, and that job does not include the maintenance of teams. So in the end, when they would every few months they would ask all the owners like whether they need all the teams, what these folks would do, they would answer immediately within minutes, yes, and done. Why? Because that was the easiest things for them to do and be done with it and be able to get back to their work. There was no burden for them to keep the teams, right? And they because they would be afraid of losing potentially something that they was stored somewhere, they chose to go to say, yes, we need everything, everything is still in use, even if that wasn't the case. But it was just the really easy way out for them. So that only proves that And trusting might work for some, but it's definitely not the answer to everything, right? The other day, I also talked to another customer who chose a different path. What they did is they basically introduced an internal bill. So for every team, you would be billed per month, and basically that was the way they wanted to go about making the owners to clean up resources that they do not need, because basically that department would then get billed for every team. Well, that might work for some, definitely not for everyone, but it just proves that whatever approach you choose, it needs to match your company. It needs to match the culture you have, because if you choose something that does not match who you are, it will not work in the end. You will aggravate folks, it will not work, and people might even leave teams because they say, you know what, like this doesn't work. I don't want that, and they will defer back to email or maybe even to other things like Slack because they will just find something that works. So you really need to think this through, right? Um, if you've done things right, adoption will come, right? It's only a matter of time. If you really do things correctly, if you talk to folks, if you explain why is there a need for change, why you need to change, why teams, how does that fit? If you explain all of that, if you include them in that journey, adoption will come. And you will not need to do any special best practices or tips and tricks. It will just come because it's a natural thing. If you can sell people on the promise that teams will improve the way they work, they will come. But you need to explain it to them. They need to get it. That is your job, right? And over time, usage of teams will grow, will increase, right? And at that point, like at some point, like when you would start, you would have a governance plan, and at that point, it's just a document. It's just a document with the ideas describing different things you want to enforce about teams, and that might be the way you name teams, the way you organize it, and so forth and so on. Basically, to keep aligned with who you are as a company, your culture, and the way you work. But that plan will not force itself, right? Basically, the same way we drive, well, just because there are rules and there are limits doesn't mean that everybody uh, 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 adheres to them, right? So you have to have something in place that will allow you to enforce that. And here's a trick. Whatever you think of, it needs to be able to enforce it at scale. Adoption will come, and you will have not one team, not 10, but maybe 20 with hundreds of channels, tons of messages, tabs, files, and you need to be able to manage all of that, right? And the IT will probably not scale to like go every week through all of that, view all external accounts, view all teams, whether the tabs are set the right way, whether the files, like you have to have something that will help you to enforce whatever plan you came up with to actually put it in action, right? So you have to think about it. How will you do that? And there are not number of ways in which you can approach that. Like you could, for example, think of building a PowerShell script. Like if you are techie, if you are either admin with affinity in PowerShell, or you are dev, like you can do that, right? And that will allow you to automate things. But building your own PowerShell scripts that will basically enforce your plan is not all trivial. First of all, it requires you to know where the data is. Like, where do you get the insights about where you stand? What are the different things you have in place, right? Two, you need to have the right skill to build the script. And you need to know how to authenticate, how to keep things safe, because you will be working on very maybe confidential stuff. Maybe you'll have access to teams that are related to your board meetings or something like that, right? So it all needs to be done safely, right? Additionally, as I said, teams evolve a lot. Like every week, there's update to Office 365, and that update might relate to Teams or not. It might be small, it might be big. It might affect your governance plan or not. So the moment you try to build something yourself, you also get yourself into the business of keeping up to date with all these announcements and also knowing what kind of impact they have on your plan, your company, and if they do, how you again extend your script to pull in the data and act on them. Right? So all of that costs really a lot of time, not just to build, but also to keep up to date with everything that is new as well. Then once you have the script and your adoption is going through the roof, like it might take a while for this script to run. At some point you might want to close the laptop and go home, right? But if analysis of your environment will take a day or 2 days, well, then you might need to have something else than a laptop to run it on, right? So maybe you will think of a server, or if you are already full in a cloud, you will run it in Azure. But with that, there is also operational costs. Like you will get a bill for operating this script in a cloud, right? So there's also something that you need to take into account. So with all that, it just point that it's not trivial. It's something that you need to think through. And another option is to basically look for solutions that already specialize in that already know about all of this, that are set up as a service or that run somewhere, and that there is someone else who basically is in the business of knowing and keeping the things up to date so that you can focus on the things that matter for your business, and which is probably like it's not your core work to maintain teams, right? And the key for that is like if you look for an application that is built by someone else, it has to have two things, at least. One, it needs like you have to have the ability to basically translate your governance plan to uh, things that you want to track. So basically, in your governance plan, you express that you find, for example, naming of teams important, or the way the teams have tabs, or external owners activity, right? So that solution that you pick needs to be able to allow you to set all of that, to choose what are the different things you want to keep in track. One, two, solution that you pick needs to allow you to act on these things. Like whenever there is something that doesn't match your plan, you will need to take action on it, right? Because like if it only gives you a report, that that's nice, but if a report contains 100 teams and 200 owners, well, then you will have another full-time job to send them email, call them, ping them that there is something that they need to act upon, and then track that, right? So whatever sir, whatever app you pick, that application needs to allow you to basically define how you want to act on each of these changes or non-compliant things, and that needs to be able to manage the process you have in place. In other words, imagine that there's an unused team. How do you go about it? Do you disable it, delete it? Do you need to have approval? Do you need to have approval of the manager? Does it need to go to the owner of a unit? So you need to be able to model all of that, to express all the things like departments, owners, and so forth and so on, approvals, and track all of that and automate that. Maybe there is email. Maybe if there is no reply, it has to be sent someone else. Like so, the these are all the different ways you work internally, and whatever tool you pick needs to be able to model that so that you can keep working the way you do and not adjust the way you work to a tool you pick because it doesn't offer you any other option, right? So that's something that you need to keep in mind. One, pick a tool that allows you to choose which things you want to keep track of, and two, act on them following business processes that you already have. So to recap, right? What do you need to do if you want to ensure that Teams deployment that you put in place will rock? Like first of all, you really need to understand why. What is it that you want to solve? What role will Teams plan in your company? Two, never lose track of the culture that you have, because whatever tool you put in place, it will only amplify that, right? If you don't share in the open, putting teams will not solve that. You will need to address the culture change first. You will need to encourage people to share, because just putting teams in place will not address that. Like it will just not, it will just sit covered in dust. When you start deploying teams, when you plan the whole thing, communicate, communicate, communicate more than you are okay with, because it's really key that people understand, and it takes time. It really takes, like, things might make perfect sense in your head, but everybody else is not involved in these meetings, discussions. They don't know. They miss the context, reasoning, everything else, right? So it's your job to, if you are advocate for teams, it's your job to explain it to them, like really to the point where you feel like I'm repeating myself. Well, yes, you might be, but like you can go about it two ways. If you have checklists, you can go through it as quickly as you can, and then you will feel like you're done, but you're not, and whatever you want to achieve will fail. Or you will go slowly, step by step. You will take the long route, which will feel very inefficient, but will allow you to basically achieve that and at goal, right? Because in the end, people need to buy into your goal and promise. And the only way for them to do that is if they understand what is it that you want to do. They need to get that, and for that you need to communicate a lot. Finally, whatever you put in place, whether that's the governance plan or not, it has to match who you are as a company. Putting new tool in place will not change who you are. What's more, it will amplify that. So you will really easily see how people actually work, because now it will be in the open. If you put teams in place and it's empty, well, that's a clear sign that people don't share in the open. They're hesitant, maybe there's some other reason. So it will become extra clear. Whoever you are, your character traits as a company will be visible to anybody and everybody. So think about it, because the tool you put in place will make it clear, right? And whatever plan you have, whatever their approach for governance, management of teams, it has to match who you are, because otherwise it will fail. Eventually, in the end, if you've done everything right, adoption will go through the roof, guaranteed. Because if you have people on your side, they will come and they will use Teams a lot. Using Teams will grow and will go through the roof. And for that, when that is the case, you have to have the ability to manage it at scale, because you will have a lot of stuff in Teams. And for that, you have to have something, ideally, that allows you to express the governance plan you have in, or to turn the document that you've created, the governance plan, into actionable thing, and to act on that following the business processes that you have. With that, I can take questions if there are any. Let me have a quick look at the Q&A. I believe there is something. Russ, have you seen anything? There are shout out from Holland. Yes, thank you very much. Um, there's a question. Someone's currently delaying the implementation of Teams as they want to get governance and security right. And apparently, I've motivated somebody to think about the big things and adjust along the way. Yes, so that is exactly the point, right? It's impossible for you to know everything up front, because there are so many things with Teams, and probably by the time you wrap your head around Teams, there will be something new, right? So originally we had in Teams chats, then there's also video, then there is this, then there is that, and you can also add any of the hundreds of apps, including your own LOB, right? So it's really impossible for you to know everything up front. So instead, to make things actionable and really not try to be stuck like spinning wheels, I would recommend that you think of the big things first, Like, how do you want to have teams reflect the company, whether it's departments or not, who is allowed to create and manage them, and then really talk to your folks, make them a part of that move to teams, and then you will see that there will be new things that you would never think of, simply because like you are you, like you cannot know everything, right? And you have to ensure that whatever plan you put in place, it will change, guaranteed, right? And it's only up to you to choose how often you want to go back, back to it.